Well, hello everybody in the vinyl community. It's Matt and I'm back again for another video. And I have a very special video I'll be doing today. I think I'm going to be doing a series of 2 or 3 in this little segment. And as you can see from the title of this video and from my special guest sitting next to me, you're finally getting to meet my father. This is my dad, Dave. Dad, say hello to everybody.
Hello, everybody.
So, my dad, I'm going to give you a little background first of my dad's upbringing, and just say this right at the start that to me, my parents, my dad and specifically both my parents, they were the big impetus for me getting into music, for loving music, especially the Beatles and rock and roll. And so I thought it'd be interesting for you to kind of see where that all originated from, how I developed my love for music, how I passed it on to my children, and now my children are passing it on to their children. I do have one grandson, and he's now starting to enjoy and love music as well, and certainly the classics. And so let me start with this, Dad. I'll give you a little of your background, and then I'll go into a couple of questions for you in this first segment. And my dad was born in 1930, so he'll be 88 coming up the end of this summer in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. Right at the onset of the Great Depression, obviously, right, born in 1930.
Well, it's more toward the tail end of it, but it was obvious to us as a family that things weren't that great as far as the economy, etc.
Right, it was definitely a bad time in the nation's history as far as that went, and having just passed World War I, a few years after World War I, and just before the onset of World War II is when you were kind of living your childhood, your young childhood. And your father passed away around 1939, I believe it was. You were only 8 years old,
at the
8
time.
or going on 9 years old at the time. So
I was 8, yeah.
Yeah, you were very young when your dad passed. And so you lived in Rhode Island for many years, but after your freshman year in high school, your family moved out to Western Massachusetts on kind of a farm type living, living on a farm.
Montague City outside of Turner's Falls, and a much bigger city, Greenfield, Mass.
Right. And so that's where you spent most of your teenage years and high school years, having graduated high school in 1948.
Right.
And then sometime in their very early 50s, you moved back to Rhode Island with your family. And basically, getting more into the music end of it now, I want to ask you a first question here. So you look at that background, and I wonder, could you tell me a little bit about your earliest memories involving music and what led you to enjoy music as a young boy and teenager?
Well, by chance, my brother had been in the Navy, and during World War II, he came home to stay for some time before he went on to college under the GI Bill at that time, and he loved music. He was a good piano player, a very good piano player, and he could write. And he had a friend that he hung with before he went in the Navy who played the saxophone. And when I lived in Pawtucket as a youth, they would come to the house and play music or attempt to, pardon me, to write. And I developed an interest in music, and I always enjoyed listening from the time I was a very young boy. And when my brother came home just after World War II, we were living outside of Greenfield, Mass, and he and I loved to listen to the radio. There were no television, wasn't on our menu at that time, and we would listen to New York stations where they'd have the disc jockey, and I developed a deeper interest in music with my brother because he had a very, very strong interest himself. And from that point on, I just seemed to develop a greater expanse or interest and enjoyment, especially enjoyment of music, especially listening to the DJs playing the disc and the, well, at that time, records.
Yeah. And could you just share a little bit about, you once told me a story about being a young boy and meeting one of your musical, or I don't want to say hero, but someone you were familiar with, Gene Autry. Didn't you get to meet Gene Autry?
Yeah, Gene Autry.
Could you tell everyone about that?
Yeah, I won a essay contest regarding being a good American when I was in grammar school, and I was invited to go to what was then the Rhode Island Auditorium in Providence and attend a barbecue put on by Gene Autry's group. It was a rodeo setup, and Gene was with the group with his horse, and we got to meet him. We had a barbecue with Gene Autry, and we also had a chance to shake his hand and admire him because he was a big star then. He was a Hollywood star, and on his way to becoming a multi-millionaire.
In music too, he put out albums and things.
Yes,
didn't he? Like this Christmas one. Yeah,
and he did. No, he did have a talent. He had a good voice.
Yeah,
he was enjoyable.
Did you ever get his autograph that day, or do you remember if they were giving out autographs?
No, there were at least 25 people, youngsters, attending the barbecue, and he did make a point of speaking to us individually and as a group, and he shook hands, and that was about it.
Yeah, that's nice. Yeah, and he had the horse with him too, so that must have been kind of special. Yeah. And okay, do you have any recollection of some of the early vocal groups like the Ink Spots or the Mills Brothers? Do you remember listening to them as a young man?
I loved the Ink Spots and
Mills Brothers?
Mills Brothers.
Yeah.
I loved both groups, especially the Ink Spots. I thought.
Now, would they have been somebody that was played on the radio out of New York?
Oh,
that
yeah.
You could have been listening to them?
In those days, listening to the disc jockeys was the thing to do.
Yeah.
We would spend hours at the radio, and I remember on Friday nights they'd always have a show where a person could write in, or I don't know if you could telephone, but you could write in and in hopes that you would be selected to attend a session.
That's cool.
Big band session.
Wow. And speaking of big bands, I know you met Mom in 1954 or so when you were just in the Army, and you met her in Rhode Island at an amusement park at the time, like at one of the old dance halls they used to call it.
Park,
and you just mentioned big band because I happen to have a Glenn Miller album here. What was it? Could you tell everyone what was the type of music you folks were listening to then at these amusement parks?
Yeah, it would be big bands, even local groups. They were the that was the type of music that you would have or hear when you went to a dance. Friday night and Saturday night were always dance nights. Actually, it would be, in a sense, pickup night. You'd go to the dance hall, be it Rhodes, on the Patuxent, Crescent Park, and you would really look the women over, and the girls would look the guys over, and that's how I met my wife. I happened to see her at Crescent Park during one of these dance sessions.
Right.
And
the music being played was, they would be playing Glenn Miller stuff, the Dorsey Brothers, Jimmy and Tommy Dorsey.
Even if it were local groups, they would use
that material,
music material that these big bands, famous bands, had.
Would Bert Camford have been some music was around back then, or was he later?
It was a little bit later.
He was later.
I liked the sound of his.
Like Benny Goodman, was he was one from that era, right?
Big band, Benny Goodman. these fellas all, and there were lady singers, girl singers, and they would be with these big bands, and the different players, the instrumentalists, they would go from band to band, and then many of them, like the Dorsey brothers, they started on their own. They would probably be playing for somebody like a Paul Whiteman in the early years,
right.
And then they'd end up deciding to go on their own because they became so well known, quite outstanding in their field. So they would start their own orchestras,
right?
And that's how it worked at that time for many years, especially through my teen and 20s.
Yeah.
Big bands were important. That was it.
And I must say, as a note, I didn't say in the beginning, some of the albums, well, I say the majority of them, especially a lot of the modern contemporary ones coming up, are your actual records and CDs that I have, and these are two of them. This is a Big Band's CD that was yours, and Finnegan. Finnegan.
It was Bill Finnegan and were musicians who joined together and formed this band. And one of the things that was outstanding, and I didn't know about it for many years, was the fact that they were favorites of Frank Sinatra. Frank Sinatra thought they had great instrumentation, and also that I had an opportunity to see them. I saw them twice, once in Woonsocket and the other one in, I think, in the Cranston area.
Right. And I know you had vinyl albums of theirs, because I remember being a kid, you had some Finnegan in your collection. Yeah, and this is a CD of yours you had.
Yeah. They weren't as well known as the Goodmans and
Dorsey's,
Duke Ellington and groups of that nature, but they were outstanding musicians.
Yeah. Well, it's definitely clear that during the 50s, you and Mom had musical interest. You were definitely into it and listening and following it and going to some shows, and you met Gene Autry when you were a kid. But moving on a little bit into the later 50s, and when rock and roll first came up, so now we're getting not past it, but I mean, we're going into a period of more rock and roll in the mid to late 50s when the early rockers like Bill Haley and Chuck Berry were coming up, and then eventually Elvis and beyond. When that rock and roll, that first wave of rock and roll came up in the mid to late 50s, what did you and Mom think of it? Did you enjoy any of it? What did you think of this new rock and roll thing?
Well, I wasn't what I'd call a serious fan, but you mentioned Bill Haley. My wife and I saw Bill Haley on the Jersey Shore one year.
Wow.
One summer we were there vacationing.
And did he have a good crowd? Were people into it?
And he wasn't. He had passed his peak as an outstanding artist, but he still had a great group, and they were well received by the people that attended the shows.
Oh, that's fantastic. And I happen to be holding up an Everly Brothers from that period, and you mentioned you saw the Everly Brothers.
Yeah, I saw the Everlys. They were really good.
I know Mom liked them. She liked the Everlys.
I guess as far as rock and roll goes, I enjoyed certain groups and certain songs by a given group.
Chuck Berry.
Yeah. And
some Buddy Holly.
Right. I think, the funny thing is, I think I like Buddy Holly so much more now. Every time they replay his group situation with these great guitarists like Spring Street, I listen. I'll replay it if I see it's on the television. I'll replay it and listen and spend it. I enjoyed him very much, but more in the later years. More.
Do you have any recollection of when the plane crash happened in '59 when all three of the rockers passed away?
Yeah, I remember that. That was highly publicized at the time, that they were flying in bad weather, and the Big Bopper was with them, and unfortunately, it wiped them out, so to speak.
Yeah, Richie Valens too. Yeah.
Yeah.
And you had artists like Little Richard who came out around that time.
Right.
He was a big one, and certainly Elvis. Elvis Presley kind of put everything over the edge. He was so popular. What's your recollections of Elvis from that late 50s period?
I liked him. I wasn't a crazy fan. We had a couple of female neighbors in Attleboro during his peak, and they were crazy about Elvis. Every time he'd appear anywhere within the range, within the area, they'd be sure to get a front row seat to see him.
Oh yeah, so I just want to say, so it sounds like you kind of were picking and choosing when the rock and roll first came in. You weren't a total rock and roll fanatic.
No, I never.
But if you liked certain songs by the Everlys or Buddy or certain ones or Chuck Berry, you'd latch onto that, the sound of it.
The sound, I enjoyed it. And Elvis had a great voice. I mean, he was a fantastic entertainer.
Oh yeah. Yeah, he's fantastic. Well, it sounds like, I mean, again, you're talking, by the time we're getting to the mid to late 50s, you're getting into your mid to late 20s, because you were born in 1930, so naturally, it would seem that earlier Benny Goodman, Sinatra, Sauter Finnegan, Dorsey Brothers, Mills Brothers, Ink Spots, that would be more from that 1940s era when you were very young, teenager, early 20s, when people are most influenced by music. Yeah. By the time you're getting into the heavy rock and roll of the late 50s, mid to late 50s, you're in your late 20s now. So it's kind of nice that you still enjoyed some of it, even though you weren't a teenager when it first came out.
Yeah, and they were still popular. I mean, they didn't have the strength as far as a draw for entertaining people, but they were still great artists.
Oh, the earlier artists from
And then what happened was, groups came in, like the Four Aces and the Ink Spots, the Mills Brothers, and it seemed that it changed, that the big band wasn't down at Rhodes on the Patuxent. That was a place famous for bringing in quality entertainment. They went from the big band, and for a number of years you would see a group.
Oh, the groups, like you mentioned,
The group would be there. They'd be the headliner.
I think Mom even gave a memory, maybe you can just reiterate it, is that she saw Johnny Ray at one time in Rhode Island. She saw her, which he was almost as big as Sinatra in the day, in the 40s, right?
Yeah, and she enjoyed music, and she was a big Sinatra fan too. She enjoyed Frank Sinatra.
Oh, he's from that era in the 40s.
Yeah.
Well, after that, I'll just say, like, we got that major rock and roll period, mid to late 50s, coming into the 60s now. And obviously your first child, me, was born in 1961, and then you had a second child born in 64, my younger brother, 3 years younger than me. So I'll tell you what, we'll end part 1 right there. And hoping you'll all come back to check out part 2. We're going to move into the 60s now and specifically talk a little bit about the Beatles and beyond. So with that, thank you, and hope you'll join us for part 2.